Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, continuing on with the Kitab al-Bay', and the next chapter speaks about the forbiddance of selling succulent dates for dried dates, except in the case of Ariya. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab says, the Prophet forbade al-Muzabana and al-Muhaqala. He says al-Muzabana means to sell succulent dates for dried dates. Succulent dates are rutab and dried dates are tamar. And al-Muhaqala means to sell the crops growing from the ground for wheat which has already been harvested. And also it means to lease out a land and that the payment is a part of the wheat which grows on the land. Okay, so to explain this, al-muzabana is exchanging succulent dates for dried dates. When you exchange date for date, these are ribawi items, which means they must be exchanged on the spot, so no deferred payment, and they must be of equal measure. The problem is that you cannot be sure what an equal measure is between succulent dates and dried dates. You cannot have equal measure. You can have equal measure between dried dates and dried dates, or between succulent dates and succulent dates, but not between dried dates and succulent dates. And likewise with the muhaqala, to sell the crops growing from the ground with the wheat already harvested. It is not possible to have equal measure, because again, wheat is from ribawi items, and they must be exchanged with equal measure. As for what he says about leasing a land, so a person works on it, and his wages would be a fraction of the produce grown on the land, this is actually halal, and we do have conflicting reports, but the way to reconcile between the conflicting reports is to say, this is halal as long as the payment is a fraction of the produce in the land. So it must not be a particular portion of the land which the man is going to take, because that portion or part of the land may not produce much crops, whereas the other portions may produce a large amount of crops, and this will be unfair on the worker. But as for if you just stipulate a known fraction, then there is nothing wrong with that, and the narrations tell us that this is absolutely fine. What is not allowed is to stipulate a particular measure. Let's say you'll have 100 sa of wheat. This is not allowed because the total produce of the land may well be 100 sa. So that means the whole payment will go to the worker and nothing left for the owner of the land. This type of thing leads to disputes. So just a fixed and agreed upon fraction is what is required. As for making a person work on your land for monetary payment, then there is no doubt that this is absolutely fine. And from Zayd ibn Thabit, he says the Prophet made a concession after that in allowing the rutab to be exchanged for tamar in the case of Ariya. Now what is this Ariya that we speak of? You have the rutab on the dead palm trees, and a person who wants these rutab does not have any money. Rather he does have with him dried dates, which are tamar. So let us suppose he has 1 sa of tamar. Now he's allowed to go to the person who owns the rutab, and what will happen is that they will estimate how much rutab will we need to take so that when the rutab become dry, they will be equal to 1 sa. So we make this estimation, and based upon that estimation, we are allowed to exchange the tamar for that amount of rutab. This is allowed as long as the amount exchanged is less than 5 awsuq. 1 wisq is 60 sa. That is a condition which we know from the authentic narrations. Also from the condition, this person who wants the rutab, he must not have any money. As for if he has money, then the deal's off. He must pay with the money. Also from the condition is that he must eat these dates, not just take them to store them. One can easily argue, but this rukhsa that is given, is this not straight out riba al-fadl? Because as long as you do not know that they are of equal measure, it will be riba al-fadl. We say yes, it is riba al-fadl, but here it is allowed in a case of a need. This is not even a necessity, this is merely a need, a haja. And the reason why it is allowed in the case of a need or a haja is because riba al-fadl is not the ultimate form of riba. The ultimate form of riba is riba al-nasi'a, because riba al-fadl means you're exchanging 2 items of an unequal amount. This will lead to deferred payment, because the one who's giving more, he will want to defer the payment, because if you're giving back more, you would obviously want more time, and this would lead to the nasi'a, which means a defer. So it would be a deferred payment. And the Prophet said, إِنَّمَا الرِّبَى فِي النَّسِيئَةِ. Riba is only in the deferment. This is why Ibn Abbas did not deem riba al-fadl to be riba. He only deemed riba nasi'ah to be riba, until he was told by Abu Sa'id al-Khudri that no, riba al-fadl is also haram as well. And then Ibn Abbas changed his mind. So we say because riba al-fadl is a wasila, it is a means to the ultimate riba, it will be allowed in the case of a need. Just as, for example, silk for men is allowed in the case of a need, such as if you have an itch. And we have textual evidence for this. Prophet allowed a couple of his companions to wear a silk shirt because of an itch that they had. Silk is not haram in and of itself, rather it is haram because of what it leads to. It leads to the man being effeminate. And so even if the Bay'ul Araya is allowed, it is still restricted to beneath 5 awsuq. The word Araya, plural of Ariya, literally means naked. And the reason is because this contract is, if you like, naked from money. There's no money involved. There's no dinar or dirham or pounds or euros involved. It is just dates for dates. Also take note of the condition. The man must be eating these succulent dates. He must not exchange these dried dates for succulent dates in order to hoard them, or that they would become dried later on. No, this will invalidate the transaction. In another wording from Abu Hurairah, he says the Prophet gave a rukhsa, or a lightening of the load, for the Bay'ul Araya. The succulent dates would be estimated how much they would be if they were dried, in that which is less than 5 awsuq, he says, or for 5 awsuq. One of the narrators, Dawud, is in doubt. So he's in doubt whether it was 5 awsuq or less than 5 awsuq. It is safer to say that it ought to be less than 5 awsuq, because less than 5 awsuq we have no doubt about. The doubt is on the exact 5 awsuq figure. And so we ought to leave the doubtful matter. This would certainly be safer. So bringing everything together, we say that for the Ariya, there are 5 conditions. Number 1, that the buyer, that is the one who wants the rutab, he has no money with him. Number 2, that it should be for less than 5 awsuq. Number 3, that you're going to estimate what amount of rutab would be needed, such that if they are dried, they would equal to the amount of dried dates that we have, be it 1 sa', 2 sa', or whatever. Number 4, that the purchaser is taking the rutab in order to eat them straight away, not in order to hoard them such that they would become dried and not rutab anymore. If it is the case that they become not rutab anymore, then the transaction is batil. And condition number 5, it must be a hand-to-hand exchange, on the spot, no deferred payment allowed. Remember, dates are ribawi items, and if you exchange 2 ribawi items of the same type, then it must be an on-the-spot exchange, no deferred payment allowed, even if you are exchanging the same amount, because the one who pays later has the advantage. That's the whole point about paying later, is that the advantage is for you, the one who pays later. And when you exchange ribawi items, then no one is allowed to have an advantage. Question, can we do the same thing with grapes and raisins? Because raisins are dried grapes, just as tamar are dried rutab. And the answer is yes, it's exactly the same thing. Grapes are ribawi items, so the exact same conditions and rules will apply. Also note that with the ariya, the purchaser is going to take the rutab from the date palm tree. He's going to pick them off. So it's not the same as if someone was to come to another person with a crate, let's say, full of rutab, and he sells that crate full of rutab to the purchaser for tamar. That is not the same as the ariya which we are talking about. And this type of transaction will not be allowed because the at-tasawi, or equal measure, is impossible between rutab and tamar, as we have said. The reason why at-tasawi is impossible because the Prophet ﷺ asked his companions about the rutab, أَيَنْقُصُ إِذَا جَفَّ? Would they decrease in their measurement if they are dried? They said yes. And so upon that then, the Prophet forbade rutab to be sold for tamar. So this is the general rule. It is a haram transaction. And a very specific exception is for if the purchaser goes and takes the rutab off from the tree. So he picks it off from the tree. Let's take a look at this next chapter about the one who sells a date palm tree which has fruits on them. From Ibn Umar, the Prophet ﷺ said, مَنِ ابْتَاعَ نَخْلًا بَعْدَ أَن تُؤَبَّرَ فَثَمَرَتُهَا للذي باعها إلا أن يشترط المبتاع ومن ابتاع عبدا فماله للذي باعه إلا أن يشترط المبتاع. Whoever sells a date palm tree after it has been pollinated, then its fruits belong to the vendor unless the purchaser stipulates otherwise. And whoever sells a servant, then any wealth or possession that the servant has belongs to the master, that is the vendor, unless the buyer stipulates otherwise. So, why should the fruits belong to the vendor? Because the vendor has made an effort to pollinate the tree, and so his heart will be attached to the tree, because when you make an effort, you want to know the results of your work. So his heart will be attached to the fruits of this tree because of his efforts. This is why the Sharia assigns the fruits to the vendor, unless the purchaser stipulates otherwise. As for the servant, then anything that the servant has, maybe his clothes, glasses, and so on, they belong to the vendor because he is the master, unless the purchaser stipulates otherwise. The hadith does say the wealth of the servant. It does not mean that the servant owns something, but rather what the hadith intends is that which is specific to the servant. For example, like we said, his glasses or his clothes and so on. Just like we might say the saddle of the horse. The horse does not own the saddle. He did not buy the saddle, but it is something specific for the horse. So it is not a mulk of the horse, rather it is ikhtisas, something specific solely for the horse. Can a servant ever own anything? Well, some said no, never. Others said yes, he can. A third opinion is that if his master gives him something to own, then yes, he can own it. But if another person from outside gives him something to own, then that automatically belongs to his master. Here's a scenario. What if the servant has some silver coins and the purchaser purchases the servant with silver coins? Now, silver for silver is a ribawi exchange, so they must be equal in amount. But if the servant has just a few silver coins and the purchaser is delivering a large amount of silver coins, then do we say that this is an exchange for a large amount of silver coins for a small amount of silver coins, the small amount being in the hand of the servant, and hence this would be a ribawi transaction? Well, here it depends on the intention of the purchaser. If the purchaser is intending the silver coins in the hand of the servant, then yes, it must be an equal for equal measure, because it's a ribawi item we're dealing with here, silver. As for if the purchaser does not intend the silver coins, but rather he intends to purchase the servant, the silver coins are just in following, then no, this would not be a ribawi transaction. As for if the purchaser intends both the servant and the silver coins, then here some scholars would say it is haram. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah says that if the measurements are equal, then it is permissible. For example, the purchaser is purchasing for 1,000 dirham, that's 1,000 silver coins. The servant is worth 900 dirham, and he has in his hands 100 dirham. It totals to 1,000, and this is exactly how much the purchaser is paying. Shaykh al-Islam says that if this is the case, then that purchase is allowed, because it's as if to say, you are purchasing the servant for 900 dirham. Let that be one purchase. That is allowed. And then follow that up with a second independent purchase, which is 100 dirham for 100 dirham, and that is of course allowed as well, if it's on the spot. So instead of making two separate independent transactions, just put it all into one, and it amounts to the same thing. This is how Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah argues. Let's look at the next chapter about the forbiddance of al-muhaqala, muzabana, mukhabara, and fruits before they are in good condition, and the mu'awama. The narration of Jabir ibn Abdullah says that the Prophet forbade al-muhaqala and muzabana and al-mukhabara, and selling fruits before they are in good condition, and that they should only be sold for dinar or dirahim, except in the case of ariya. The mukhabara which is mentioned is exactly what the Prophet did to the people of Khaybar. You work on our land and we will give you a fixed fraction of the crops that are produced. This is allowed, but the narration says it is not allowed, and the reason why it's not allowed is because we understand the narration to be that the type of mukhabara is that a person says you will have the crops from a particular section of the land, or in a particular time period, or a fixed amount of crops. That is not allowed, because it leads to dispute. Also in the chapter, the Prophet forbade what is called al-mu'awama, or also what can be called Bay'u Sinin. So this word mu'awama comes from am, which means a year, or if you like, selling in a particular time period. So what's all this about? Well, the owner of the land will give the land to the worker, so that the worker works on the land growing the crops, and he will say to him, you will have the crops of the first year, and I will have the crops of the second year, or something to that nature. This is impermissible. Why? Because the first year may produce much crops, and the second year produces very little crops. So what's that going to lead to? It's going to lead to this idea that the other person has got his one-up over me, and that I've been dealt with unfairly. So you can see there is much gharar involved in this. Gharar meaning when either you do not know whether you will receive the merchandise, or if you are going to receive the merchandise, you do not know what it will be like in terms of its description. So it resembles gambling, because gambling is exactly gharar. Also from the chapter, the Prophet forbade a thunya. A thunya from the word istithna, when you make an exception. So I will sell you all the fruits on this tree except a portion of them. You have not defined how much the exception is. So this is majhul, it's unknown. It might be much, it might be little. So again, we find gharar involved. As for if the exception is known, then there is no problem in this. So we say that the thunya mentioned in the narration of this chapter, which the Prophet forbade, is the type of thunya or the exception which is unknown. As for a known exception, then there is no problem. Let's move to the next chapter, which is Babu Kira'il Ard, the chapter of renting out land. From the narration of Jabir, he says the Prophet forbade renting out land. Also from Jabir ibn Abdullah, the Prophet said, من كانت له أرض فليزرعها فإن لم يزرعها فليزرعها أخاه. Whoever has land, then let him grow crops on it. If he does not grow crops on it, then let his brother grow crops on it. The second narration here teaches us that you should not let your land go to waste. Either you cultivate it, or if you're not going to, let another person cultivate it so the land is made use of. It appears this order to allow somebody else to cultivate the land is not an order of obligation, rather an order of recommendation. Because another hadith says that if he does not give this land to someone else, then let him keep hold of it. So a choice is given. The Prophet says in another wording, فَإِنْ أَبَى فَلْيُمْسِكْ أَرْضَهُ. If he does not give it to somebody else to cultivate, then let him keep hold of his land. In another wording from Jabir ibn Abdullah, he says the Prophet forbade that some wages be taken for working on the land, or that a portion of the land be taken for working on it. The word kira, as in kira'ul ard, comes from the verb gara, yugari, which means to lease out something, so that you will hire somebody to work on your land, so that you will pay him and he works on your land. Now either the payment could be done just in terms of money, or the payment could be as part of the crops which the land produces. Jabir ibn Abdullah in the chapter says, we used to rent land during the lifetime of the Prophet for 1/3 or a quarter of the product of the land, and we would irrigate the land with the help of the canals. The Prophet addressed this issue, he says. The Prophet ordered us, whoever has land should cultivate it, but if he does not cultivate it, then he should give it to his brother to cultivate. But if he does not give it to his brother to cultivate, then he should retain it. So in other words, the Prophet is forbidding hiring somebody to work on your land. The Prophet is forbidding this. Also, in the chapter, Nafi' reports that Umar ibn al-Khattab used to hire people to work on the land, and a hadith on the authority of Rafi' ibn Khadij, the freed servant of the Prophet, was conveyed to Umar. Rafi' said that the Prophet forbade people to hire out others to work on their land, and in response, Umar radiallahu anh abandoned the practice of renting out the land for others to work on. The next chapter is about renting land for food. Rafi' ibn Khadij says, we used to plough the land during the time of the Prophet and rented it for 1/3 or a quarter of the produce of the land, with a definite quantity of corn. He says, one day a man from my uncles came to us and said that the Prophet has forbidden such a practice. Though this practice was a source of benefit for us, but obedience of Allah and the Messenger is more beneficial. The Prophet commanded the owner of the land to cultivate it or let it be cultivated by his brother. but he showed disapproval of renting it out for part of the produce or anything else besides it. We take from this narration a vital lesson that Rafi' ibn Khadij says that renting out the land for a portion of the produce of the land was a source of benefit for us, but he says that obeying Allah and the Messenger is yet more beneficial. This is a great lesson. When you're doing something for which there is a benefit to you, but authentic news comes to you that it is haram, then you might be thinking, but if I leave off this practice, I will be forfeiting much benefit to me. We say, yes, you will be forfeiting much benefit to you, but the obedience of Allah and the Messenger is yet more beneficial than this particular practice of yours. And we find from this narration what we find from all of these narrations in the previous chapter, many of them, that renting out the land for a share of the produce was forbidden. Let us move to the next chapter about renting out the land for gold and silver. Hanzala ibn Qais asked Rafi' ibn Khadij radiyallahu anhu about the renting of land. He replied that Allah's Messenger forbade the renting of land. And then Hanzala asked, but what if it is for gold and silver? Thereupon he replied, if it is paid in gold and silver, then there is no harm in it. So what this narration means to tell us is that if the wages of the worker working on the land is part of the crops produced on the land, then it is not allowed. But if the wages of the worker is just money, so gold coins or silver coins, that obviously does not grow from the land, it's not part of the crops. So if that's the payment, then there is no problem with that. However, in the next narration, we find more detail. Again, Hanzala ibn Qais asks Rafi' ibn Khadij about renting the land for gold and silver. He replied, there is no problem with that. He said that the people used to rent out the land during the time of the Prophet on the madhiyanat, which are the riverbanks, and at the ends of the streamlets, and in portions of the field. And it would so happen that at times certain portion of the land was destroyed and other portion of the land was saved, whereas on other occasions this portion was saved and that one was destroyed. And so obviously the payment could only be made from the piece of land which was saved, that is to say the payment from the crops. He says it was due to this that the Prophet forbade such a contract, because of the gharar involved. But he goes on to say, but if the payment is something definite and reliable, then there is no harm in it. Now this narration, which you have just heard, this is the vital narration, because there are many narrations which tell us that you are not allowed to rent out the land, that is, hire somebody to work on your land, and that his payment will be part of the produce of the land. So many narrations telling us that this is not permissible. However, this narration is the bottom line, that the only reason why such a contract was forbidden is because of the gharar involved. If you say that you will have the crops of the, let's say, eastern part of the land, but suppose the eastern part of the land is destroyed, so you cannot have the crops anymore as the payment. So this involves gharar. However, if you were to say you will work on the land and whatever the land produces, you will have a quarter of it. Now here it does not matter which part of the land produces crops and which part is destroyed, because a quarter is a quarter, either way. It is something known and definite and there is no gharar involved. So the point is, you can hire somebody to work on your land for a fixed fraction of the produce. And this is what the Prophet did with the Yahud of Khaybar. Another example of gharar would be, let's say, if he is growing wheat and barley, and he says that I will have the barley and you can take the wheat. Again, this is gharar because maybe most of the produce is barley and the minority is wheat and so on. So this is much like gambling, where one person gains and the other one loses, and it's going to create a feeling of enmity that the other one has got his one up over me. In another chapter about giving a land as a gift, from Ibn Abbas, the Prophet said, لَأَنْ يَمْنَحَ الرَّجُلُ أَخَاهُ أَرْضَهُ خَيْرٌ لَهُ مِنْ أَنْ يَأْخُذَ عَلَيْهَا خَرْجًا مَعْلُومًا. It is better for someone to lend out his land to his brother to make use of, rather than leasing it out and taking money in return. So the Prophet is saying this is better than the other. It does not mean that leasing your land out is haram, but rather all the Prophet is saying is that giving it as a gift is better for your reward than charging money for it. And we know this hadith cannot mean that it is haram to lease out your land, because like we said before, there are many evidences that leasing out your land is absolutely fine. Next we move on to Kitab al-Musaqah wal-Muzara'ah. This narration from Abdullah ibn Umar, he says when Khaybar had been conquered, the Yahud who were residents there asked the Prophet to let them continue living on the land and cultivating it, and that the Yahud will take half of the share of the produce, the other half going to the Prophet. And the Prophet told them, أُقِرُّكُمْ فِيهَا عَلَى ذَلِكَ مَا شِئْنَا. I will allow you to continue here as long as we desire. Of the half which went to the Muslims, the Prophet took a fifth for himself and his family. It is also reported in other wordings that when Umar was the Khalifa, he expelled them from Khaybar to Tayma and Ariha. They were two villages in the Arabian Peninsula, but they were outside the Hijaz area. And Umar had the right to do that because the Prophet said, we will allow you to stay here as long as we wish. So what is Muzara'a? Muzara'a from Zara, which means to cultivate a land. It simply means that the worker is going to cultivate the land and he will have a fixed fraction of the produce of the land. Musaqa from Saqi, meaning to give water, simply means that the person or the worker is going to water the trees will grow and they will produce fruits, and he will have a fixed portion of the total fruits. So that is the difference between Muzara'a and Musaqa. Musaqa is specific to the fruit trees and watering them, whereas the Muzara'a is more about the field. We also learn from the chapter that the Prophet gave his wives every year 100 wisq, 80 wisq of dried dates and 20 of barley. And when Umar was in power, he gave the wives a choice. Either you keep to this, or you can choose instead the land and water. And so some of the wives chose land and water, and others chose the 100 wisq. Aisha and Hafsa were amongst those who chose the land and water. Just returning to the words of the Prophet, أُقِرُّكُمْ فِيهَا عَلَى ذَلِكَ مَا شِئْنَا. We will allow you on this land for as long as we want to. Some scholars said, using these words, that the Muzara'a is an aqdun jaiz for the owner of the land, because the Prophet is saying, we will allow you to work on this for as long as we wish. So that is to say, we can annul the contract whenever we want to, and that makes it into an aqdun jaiz, as opposed to an aqdun lazim, which means you cannot just annul it whenever you want to. Some other scholars said that it is an aqdun lazim, but it's just that the Prophet is stipulating a choice for his own self. And if the Yahud agree to it, then that's fine. So they would say that based upon this, if at the beginning of the contract of the either Musaqa or Muzara'a, nobody stipulates a choice to annul it, then the status quo, or the basic rule on the Muzara'a and Musaqa, is that it is an aqdun lazim, up to the date of the end of the contract. And this seems to be the stronger opinion, that neither the owner of the land nor the worker of the land is allowed to just annul the contract before its due date. Rather, you have to go ahead with it, and it is an aqdun lazim, just as a sales contract is, or an ijara, or a hiring contract. We can also take from this that you're allowed to deal with the Yahud and Nasara for that matter, and non-Muslims for that matter, as well in business dealings and so on. One might ask, but can you trust the Yahud? And Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَلَا تَزَالُ تَطَّلِعُ عَلَى خَائِنَةٍ مِّنْهُمْ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مِّنْهُمْ. You will not cease to witness treachery from them, except a few of them. Well, the answer is yes, we can trust them in business dealing, because the Prophet did do business deals with them. But if there is signs that they have treachery, then we cancel the deal. In the Muwatta of Imam Malik, the Prophet ﷺ sent Abdullah ibn Rawaha to the Yahud to judge between them and to rectify their affairs, and he told them outright that the Prophet is the most beloved to me, and you are the most hated to me. But despite my love for the Prophet and my hatred of you, it will not prevent me from carrying out justice amongst you. To which the Yahud replied, بِهَذَا قَامَتِ السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ. This is what makes the heavens and the earth exist upright. That is to say, even though you hate somebody, this hatred of yours will not prevent you from dealing with that somebody with justice. Because of course you'll deal with the people you love with justice. True justice becomes manifest when you deal with the people you hate, not the people you love. So how will you deal with the people you hate? Because it's easy to abuse them and to not give them their rights because you hate them. But real justice is done when you deal with justice with the people you hate. We also learned that Umar, when he was the Khalifa, he expelled them to two villages outside the Hijaz, which were Tayma and Ariha. Now, why did he do this? This was not a transgression on the part of Umar, rather, it was a transgression on the part of the Yahud, which ought to be no surprise. The Yahud would consistently transgress against the Sahaba, such as his son Abdullah ibn Umar. And we know the Prophet had also said, أخرجوا اليهود والنصارى من جزيرة العرب. Expel the Yahud and Nasara from the Arabian Peninsula. So this would then mean, possibly, that Tayma and Ariha are not from the Jazirat al-Arab, if Umar is going by that hadith, to expel the Yahud and Nasara from the Jazirat al-Arab. Another question is that what if they enter into the Muzara'a or Musaqa, but they do not stipulate the time limit as to how long this contract will last for? Well, in this case we say that the contract can be annulled, but only after the year is out. So you cannot annul it during the year when the crops are being grown, because this would create a harm on the other party. And we say about the Aqdun Jaiz is that the one who is annulling the contract, if in annulling the contract there ensues a harm on the other party, then this Aqdun Jaiz actually becomes an Aqdun Lazim on the one who is not being harmed. And the reason for that is quite clear, because you're not allowed to cause harm to the other party. So if in annulling the contract you're causing harm, then we say no, you are not allowed to do this, and this contract now is an Aqdun Lazim, so a binding contract upon you, so as to prevent you from causing harm to the other. Another point is that Khaybar was conquered by force. So does that not mean that the fighters would become servants of the Muslims? The answer here is no, the Prophet did not take the Yahud as servants, although he had the right to do so. Rather, he just kept them as free workers on that land. Here we may ask a question. We know that Ariya is an exception that is made to the Muzabana in the case of dates. Can we make an analogy and say that Ariya can also apply to grapes and raisins? The point here is that Ariya is an exception to the rule. The rule is that it is haram to exchange these two items because of riba. And when an exception is made to the general rule, then we need to stick to that exception, because we must stick to the text. So if a text allows something which is otherwise haram, then it is not for us to take liberties and extend the ruling to other matters as well, unless the text itself gives us a clear illah, or a clear justification. Whereas here, the text simply mentions dates. It does not mention anything else, so it is better for us to stick to that and not to take liberties and include in this grapes and raisins, because exchanging grapes with raisins is a ribawi contract and therefore haram, and yet we have no text to make any exceptions for us. Okay, here's a question. Can a person enter into an Ariya contract with one vendor and an Ariya contract with a second vendor, such that he has less than 5 awsuq of Ariya with one and less than 5 awsuq of Ariya with another one? So in total then, he actually has more than 5 awsuq of Ariya, and yet we said that the maximum capacity is less than 5 awsuq, for which the Ariya is permissible. There is a difference, but what appears to be the case from the narration, and the safer option is to say that it is 5 awsuq mutlaqan. In other words, you're never ever allowed to go above 5 awsuq, even if it is spread out through different contracts. Okay, let's reverse it around. Can the vendor who has the rutab enter into 2 contracts with 2 different people for the Ariya contract, each Ariya being less than 5 awsuq? So between the 2 contracts, he's actually giving away more than 5 awsuq of the rutab. The weightier opinion here is yes, it is permissible. Now why should that be? Because the Ariya is in place for the need of the owner of the tamar who wants to eat the rutab, and he just has tamar lying around and they will go to waste. So he may as well just use it as money to purchase the rutab. So the 5 awsuq are important for the owner of the tamar who wants to eat the rutab, and the Ariya is for his need. So that means the vendor is not restricted by the 5 awsuq. And in entering 2 contracts with 2 different people here, he is fulfilling the need of these 2 purchases, which is the aim of the Ariya contract. So note that the 5 awsuq is a restriction on the purchaser, not the vendor. The purchaser being the one who owns the tamar and the vendor being the one who owns the rutab on the date palm tree. Also note that it is the rutab which are to be estimated as dried dates, not the other way around. So we say how many of these rutab, if they were dried, would equal to the tamar presented by the purchaser. We do not do it the other way around. We do not say how many of these tamar, if they became rutab, would equal to the rutab on the tree, because this is the way that it has been described to us. Let us move to the next chapter about the excellence of planting a tree. We'll pick a narration from this chapter. They're all similar. From Jabir ibn Abdullah, he says the Prophet visited a woman called Bashir al-Ansari at her orchard of date palm trees. And he said to her, Man gharasa hadha al-nakhl? Who planted these trees? A Muslim am kafir? Was it a Muslim or was it a kafir? فقالت بل Muslim. She replied, no, it was a Muslim. To which the Prophet responded, لا يغرس مسلم غرسا ولا يزرع زرعا فيأكل منه إنسان ولا دابة ولا شيء إلا كانت له صدقة. No Muslim person ever plants a tree or grows crops, and then after that a human or any animal eats from it, except that he will have sadaqah thereby. We can take from this hadith that if you plant a tree or sow some crops and people make use of it, then you are all the while gaining reward, the reward of sadaqah. So this could be happening even when you are unaware. And one may even use this hadith to say that any action which you perform whose benefit reaches other people, then you are rewarded by this action even if you did not intend the benefit to reach others. But you are rewarded merely by the fact that the benefit has reached others. One can also use the ayah in Surah An-Nisa, لا خير في كثير من نجواهم إلا من أمر بصدقة أو معروف أو إصلاح بين الناس. There is no goodness in their secret counsels except for the one who orders sadaqah, charity, or ma'roof, some good doing, or islah bayn al-nas, reconciliation between people who are arguing with each other or warring with each other. But then he goes on to say, وَمَنْ يَفْعَلْ ذَلِكَ ابْتِغَاءَ مَرْضَاتِ اللَّهِ فَسَوْفَ نُؤْتِيهِ أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. But whoever does this, seeking the pleasure of Allah, then we shall grant him a manifest reward. So if you have the noble intention as well, then you will have a greater reward than if you did not have that intention of seeking the pleasure of Allah. And similar to this would be disseminating knowledge of the deen. Because when you disseminate knowledge of the deen, then anyone who listens and benefits from it, you will be rewarded. So there could be thousands of people listening to you and you are not even aware, be it in your life or after your death. And all the while you are accruing this sadaqah. Notice also the Prophet asked, who planted these trees? Was it a Muslim or a kafir? Now there's a reason why the Prophet asked this question, because it makes a difference as to whether it was a Muslim or a kafir who planted it. Because if there was no difference, there would be no need for the Prophet to ask such a question. And the difference is that the kafir is not rewarded in the hereafter for the good deeds which he does. So if he performs a good deed, a righteous deed to benefit others, let's say give charity or even plant a tree and so on, then he can be rewarded in this world. We in fact have evidence for that. That if a kafir does righteous actions, he is given his provisions in this world. But a Muslim is given his provisions in this world and the reward in the hereafter. But even charity from a kafir will not be accepted in the hereafter. Allah Jalla wa Ala says in Surah At-Tawbah, وَمَا مَنَعَهُمْ أَن تُقْبَلَ مِنْهُمْ نَفَقَاتُهُمْ إِلَّا أَنَّهُمْ كَفَرُوا بِاللَّهِ وَبِرَسُولِهِ وَلَا يَأْتُونَ الصَّلَاةَ إِلَّا وَهُمْ كُسَالَى وَلَا يُنْفِقُونَ إِلَّا وَهُمْ كَارِهُونَ. The only thing prevented their expenditure from being accepted is that they made kufr in Allah and in His Messenger. And they only came to the prayer in a lazy state, that is the munafiqun, and they unwillingly gave in charity. So kufr in Allah and the Messenger will prevent your charity from being accepted. That is, you're being rewarded in the hereafter. If that is the case for charity, which benefits others, then what about the case for those actions which only benefit yourself, such as, for example, the salah, the siyam, and the hajj? Those actions will not be accepted with a greater reason. But what if a kafir plants the tree, but then after that, a Muslim purchases this tree off the kafir. And then thereafter, humans and animals eat from the tree. Who will be rewarded in this case? Well, it will be the Muslim, not the kafir. Even though the Muslim in our scenario did not actually plant the tree. But the point is that the other people and animals are taking benefit from his possession, which is why he will be rewarded. What about if he owns a tree and he prevents the birds from eating from the fruits? Well, here we say one ought not to do that because you'll be depriving your own self of a sadaqah, unless it be the case that the birds are harming your property, in which case you have the right to defend your property from them. But of course, if there are birds whom you own as a pet, then you are not allowed to not feed them, because if you own pets, you absolutely must feed them and not allow them to go hungry and be harmed thereby. We know of the famous hadith in the Sahih of the woman who kept back her cat and did not feed it nor let it out to catch its prey until the cat died, and this woman went to Jahannam thereby. The next chapter is about not taking the price of the fruits which have been destroyed. From Jabir ibn Abdullah, the Prophet said, لو بعت من أخيك ثمرا فأصابته جائحة فلا يحل لك أن تأخذ منه شيئا بما تأخذ مال أخيك بغير حق. If you sell fruits to your brother and these fruits become stricken with calamity, it is not permissible for you to take any money from him. Why should you take the wealth of your brother without due right? What this hadith is talking about are the fruits being destroyed by natural calamity, be it due to rain or a storm or a fire and the like. Then if you have sold these fruits to your brother, or to anyone else for that matter, then you are not allowed to take the money for it, because you'll be taking the money, and what will the purchaser be receiving? Well, nothing essentially. There's no good in destroyed fruits. As for if the fruits are destroyed by another person, then if they are destroyed by the vendor, and this is after the sales contract has been made, then the purchaser is allowed to demand similar such fruits from the vendor. If not, then he is allowed to demand the money for the destroyed fruits. If they are destroyed by the purchaser, then nothing else needs to be done. It's like you're destroying your own property. If they are destroyed by someone you cannot make into a guarantor, such as, for example, a group of thieves or highwaymen, the qutta' tariq, because these people are obviously evasive, you cannot just take them to account and make them into a guarantor, then in this case it takes the same ruling as the ja'iha, as the natural calamity. And that is to say that the vendor is not allowed to take the price of the fruits from the purchaser. On the other hand, if they are destroyed by someone you can make into a guarantor, so you can take them into court, then here the purchaser has a choice. He can annul the contract so that he does not owe any money to the vendor, or he could go ahead with the contract and make the perpetrator give him the fruits or buy the fruits on his behalf. If the purchaser annuls the trade, then obviously the vendor is going to demand his rights from the perpetrator. We find this hadith is specifically about fruits, but could other scenarios also take the same ruling? For example, if somebody rents out a place to use it as a shop, but the place is, let's say, burnt down through this natural calamity, do we say that this person has to pay the full rent? Or do we say, like what the hadith says, that if the item is destroyed, why should you take money from the purchaser? So in this case, we would have to say that the one who is hiring will pay to the amount he has used, but will not pay for the amount that has been destroyed. So if he used the premises for 2 months, he will pay 2 months of rent payment. But if it was destroyed after the 2 months, then he will not need to pay for the rent payment for after these 2 months. And this is what seems to be the better opinion in accordance with this hadith, even though it is about fruits specifically. But the Prophet said, بِمَا تَأْخُذُ مَالَ أَخِيكَ بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ. Why should you take the wealth of your brother without due right? This part is general. The next chapter is about making a reduction in the debt which is owed to you. From Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhu, the Prophet said, a man suffered a loss in the fruit which he had bought, and his debt increased. So the Prophet told the people to give him charity, so that he can pay his debt back off. So they did so, but even their charity was not enough to pay the debt in full. So the Prophet told the creditors, خُذُوا مَا وَجَدْتُمْ وَلَيْسَ لَكُمْ إِلَّا ذَلِكَ. Take what you find from this money, and you will not have anything besides that. We find from this narration that somebody who is in debt and is genuinely poor, and you know that to be the case, or it is predominant in your thoughts that this is the case, then it is legislated to give him charity and help him pay off his debt. This is sadaqah on your part. Notice what the Prophet says, خُذُوا مَا وَجَدْتُمْ وَلَيْسَ لَكُمْ إِلَّا ذَلِكَ. Take what you find and you will not have anything besides that. Does this mean that the rest of the debt is waived? The answer is no. The rest of the debt is still in effect. It's still in the financial liability of the debtor, so that in future, when he does attain wealth, he will have to pay it back. But it's just that right here and now, you are not allowed to demand anything except that which you find. Because as we know, Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَإِن كَانَ ذُو عُسْرَةٍ فَنَظِرَةٌ إِلَى مَيْسَرَةٍ. And if he is in straitened circumstances, then you must give him respite up until a time when it is easy for him to pay. Another narration from Aisha, she says the Prophet heard the voice of an altercation between two people, raising their voices. One owed the other a debt, and he was requesting that some remission be made to his debt, whereupon the creditor was saying, Wallahi la af'al, by Allah I will not do that. So the Prophet heard this, and he came out of his dwelling, and he said, أين المتألي على الله لا يفعل المعروف? Where is the one taking an oath by Allah that he will not do goodness? To which the creditor replied, That is me, O Messenger of Allah. فَلَهُ أَيُّ ذَلِكَ أَحَبْ. And to the debtor is whatever he desires. We take from this narration to make islah or reconciliation between two disputant parties, and that if an altercation is taking place, you should not just be a spectator, rather do whatever you can to make reconciliation. This is the case as long as you do not fear any harm on your own self if you were to get involved. Here the Prophet criticized the creditor because the creditor said, By Allah I will not do it. That is to say, I will not waive part of your debt. Now, waiving part of the debt is a righteous action, and this man is taking an oath by Allah that he will not perform a righteous action. This is not fitting. Yes, he has every right to demand his debt back in full and not waive it off. However, there's a difference between that and taking an oath by Allah that he will not do it. That is, he will not do this righteous action. Though this hadith cannot be used as an evidence to say that the creditor is obliged to remit the debt. Another narration by Abdullah ibn Ka'b ibn Malik, that Ka'b ibn Malik was demanding a debt back from Ibn Abi Hadrid in the masjid, and their voices were raised, and the Prophet heard their argumentation, and he came out to them and lifted the curtain of his apartment, and he called upon Ka'b ibn Malik. Ka'b said, Labbaik, I am here at your service, O Messenger of Allah. And the Prophet pointed out with his hands, so a hand gesture, to cut half of the debt which is due to him. And Ka'b said, I have done so. And then the Prophet said to the debtor, Qum faqdi, stand up and pay back the rest of your debt. So we notice from this narration that Ka'b ibn Malik and Ibn Abi Hadrad are having this argumentation. Ka'b wants his debt back, Ibn Abi Hadrad wants to delay, their voices are raised. And this is happening in the masjid. Now we know that buying and selling in the masjid is haram. But demanding your debt back is not the same as buying and selling. We find from this narration that demanding your debt back in the masjid is permissible, because the Prophet did not rebuke such an action, and it happened in front of him. Also we find the voices are being raised in the masjid. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِيَّاكُمْ وَهِيَشَاتِ الْأَسْوَاقِ. Be aware of raising your voices like that done in the marketplaces. So raising your voices in the masjid is impermissible. But when you are in an argumentation, you cannot think about any other thing except that which you are arguing about. And so it becomes a type of intoxication. We also find that you can communicate using hand gestures, because the Prophet gestured with his hand to cut off half the debt. So hand gestures can take the place of an actual verbal speech. and this can have many other applications in other areas, as long as there is no doubt about what the hand gesture or sign language means. The Prophet told the debtor, "Qum faqdi," stand up and pay back the rest of your debt. We assume here that he was able to pay back the other half of the debt. Let us take this next chapter. If the purchaser becomes insolvent and the vendor finds that exact commodity with the purchaser, then he has most right to it. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man adraka malahu bi'aynihi 'inda rajulin qad aflasa, fahuwa ahaqqu bihi min ghayrih." Whoever finds his commodity which he has sold with a man who is bankrupt, then he has most right to it than any other creditor. If hijr is made on a man, let's say his debts are worth £10,000 and his wealth is worth 5,000. Such a man, hijr can be made on, which is when he's prevented from trading with his wealth, and this in order to pay back the debt. In this particular example, every one of the creditor of this man will take half his debt back, because 5,000 over 10,000 equals to a half. So every creditor takes back half of his usual debt. So the one who was owed £1,000 will take 500 back. The one who was owed £600 will take 300 back, and so on. However, having said that, there is one more point needed to be noted here from this hadith, which is if the creditor finds his exact commodity with the purchaser, and this commodity has not been changed, it's exactly the way it was when he sold it, then he has most right to take back that particular commodity than anyone else. So let's say this commodity is a car, and this car has not been changed in any way. Then this creditor has the right to take back this whole car, and he will not share with the other creditors in this car like he would share with the rest of the debt. However, what if this car just by itself is worth more than the debt which is going to be paid back to him? Remember what we said in our example, every creditor will take back half of the debt owed to him. So if the debt owed to him, let's say, is £1,000, and so he's due to take £500, but the car is worth, let's say, £600. Does this mean he's going to take back £600, which is that car? The answer is no. He's not allowed to take back more than £500, because if he did take back the full £600 worth, which is the car, this will be a transgression against the other creditors. So he's not allowed to take back more than the £500. So in other words, this car can be sold for, let's say, £600, and he will take back his £500, and then the other £100 will be shared between the other creditors. So this is the case if the car is worth more than the debt which is due to him. Because remember, we are not allowed to transgress against the rights of anyone else. It is a similar case with the person who has given a rahan. The person who has given the rahan has most right to take back that particular item. The ulama have stipulated some conditions for taking back your wealth. They've said that firstly, the item must not be changed in any way, in terms of decoration or any of the description being changed. Secondly, they said that the item must not be something which itself has been sold on, so the purchaser has sold it on himself, so now somebody else's rights are in play. Or for example, the purchaser, who is now in debt, has given it as a rahan himself, so now somebody else's rights are at stake. Or for example, the rights of shufa'a, if it is a car, let's say, and two people share in the ownership of this car, then we have the right of shufa'a. So again, somebody else's rights are at stake. So it must not be the case that with this item, a car in this case, somebody else's rights are at stake. Or for example, maybe he's given it as a waqf. So again, somebody else's rights are at stake. So this is the second condition. There is another third condition, which is not immediately apparent from the wording of the hadith, but they say that if the muflis, the one who's bankrupt, so the hijr is made against him, this is the purchaser, if he has paid for some of the item, so the car in our case, if he has paid for either all or some of the item, then the vendor of the car does not have most right to the car, and he is just equal to the other creditors. And they also stipulate a fourth condition, which is taken from some wordings of the hadith, not in the sahih, outside the sahih, which is to say that if the debtor has died, then the owner of the item is an equal sharer with the rest of the creditors. So in other words, he does not have most right to that particular item of his. And this wording about the purchaser being dead is authenticated by Shaykh al-Albani and others, and so we will go by it. In other words, if the debtor is dead, then this particular hadith does not apply, and all the creditors stand on equal footing. Let's take a few more points of benefit. In the hadith of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri about a man who bought fruits and then was stricken with debts, it appears that this happened because the fruits were afflicted with blight. Then one might say, but according to the previous hadith, he should not need to pay any money if the fruits are afflicted with a natural calamity. Now the way we might reconcile this is to say that in the second narration of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri about the man being overcome with debt, it was that the fruits were sold properly after they had been ripened. As you know, that's the time when you're eligible to sell fruits. Yet the purchaser left the fruits and did not pick them or cut them from the tree, and a natural calamity overcame the fruits. Now in a case like this, it would be in the guarantee of the purchaser, because it was upon the purchaser to take his fruits. The vendor was not preventing the purchaser from taking the fruits. So the fruits become as if the purchaser deposited these fruits with the vendor for safekeeping. Now if that happens, then obviously the guarantee is on the owner of the wealth, who deposited the wealth. If, for example, you deposit a computer of yours at the house of your friend for safekeeping, and he does so, suppose the computer is destroyed through natural calamity, through no fault of your friend's, then who is the guarantor? Of course you are. You cannot hold your friend to be a guarantor. So there's one way of reconciling between the narrations. Another way of reconciling is that the fruits were not harmed in aught, but rather what happened was that the price of the fruits decreased, and so the man could not sell his fruits and make up enough money to pay off his debts. And so if seen in this way, there would be no contradiction between the narrations. We have another apparent clash. In the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha about the man who said, Wallahi la af'al, he took an oath that he will not remit the debt or reduce it. The Prophet did not approve of his taking an oath by Allah that he will not do the ma'roof, and he told him off essentially. However, does this not clash with one of the earlier hadith in Sahih Muslim about the A'rabi who came and asked the Prophet about the tenets of Islam, and when he was told the basic practices, he said, Wallahi la azidu ala hadha wa la anqus, by Allah I will not increase on this nor decrease. And the Prophet said in response, Aflaha in sadaq, he has succeeded if he has indeed spoken the truth. Note, the Prophet did not rebuke him by saying, how could you possibly take an oath by Allah that you will not increase on this? So again, he's taking an oath by Allah that he will not do righteousness or ma'roof. So why did the Prophet not rebuke this person? And we may suggest that the answer is because the contexts are completely different. This is a man who's newly embraced Islam. His iman is going to be weak and fragile, as you would expect. And so to burden him with more than the bare basics may actually put him off. So you have to deal with him much more sensitively. Whereas in the case of the narration of Aisha, this man had been a Muslim, his iman would have been stronger, and so you could deal with him more harshly. So said Al-Imam Hafidh ibn Hajar, rahimahullah. Also, if anyone were to take an oath that he will not perform any act of righteousness, then it is legislated for him to break that oath and to perform the act of righteousness, and also to expiate for breaking the oath. Let us finish with some review questions. So question number 1. What are the 5 conditions for the ariyah to be correct? Question number 2. There appears to be some controversy regarding al-mukhabara or al-muzara'a, whether it is allowed or not. We have conflicting reports. What is the reconciliation between these conflicting reports? How do we make sense of them? Question number 3. If a man finds his property with another man who is muflis or bankrupt, then he has the right to that particular property. But what are the conditions which need to be met. Mention 3 conditions